The gates of Castle Aldenmore had not been opened from the inside in 11 years. They opened now. Not slowly, not ceremonially, not with the measured dignity of a fortress receiving an honored guest. They opened the way things open when the people on the other side have run out of options, with the grinding, heavy finality of men who have calculated their remaining choices and found only one. The great iron hinges, dark with rust at their edges and cold in the November air, swung outward across the frozen ground, and the sound they made carried across the valley below like a pronouncement, like a verdict. Inside the castle, Lord Castle de Aldenmore stood on the steps of his great hall and watched the gates open and felt, for the first time in the 11 years since he had made the decision that defined the rest of his life, something that was not quite fear and not quite regret, but occupied the same territory as both, pressing against the inside of his chest with the patient, remorseless weight of things that have been postponed too long. Beside him stood his son, 23 years old, trained to inherit, wearing an expression of carefully managed composure that he had not yet had enough experience to make fully convincing. Behind him, the household had arranged itself in the instinctive hierarchy of people who understand that something historic is about to occur and wish to be positioned correctly relative to it. Servants at the edges, knights in the center, the chaplain somewhere in the back holding a cross with both hands. Across the courtyard, through the open gates, the army came into view. It was not the largest army that had ever approached Aldenmore. It was, however, precisely large enough, which is a different and more deliberate thing. 300 men, well-armed, well-fed, moving with the unhurried confidence of soldiers who have already won every engagement that mattered, and are now simply arriving at the conclusion. At their head rode a single figure, dark cloaked against the gray morning, on a horse that was too good for a man of no standing, and exactly right for a king. He stopped at the gate. He looked up at the castle that had been his home for the first 18 years of his life, and from which he had been expelled on a January morning without a sword, without a horse, without even the courtesy of his full name, stripped of it publicly, before the assembled household by the man now standing on those steps. He looked for a long time, then he looked directly at Lord Castle de Aldenmore, across the frozen courtyard, across 11 years, across everything that had been done, and everything it had cost, and everything it had, against the calculations of everyone who had made it happen, produced. He did not smile. He did not call out. He did not perform the moment for the audience assembled around it. He simply rode forward through his own gates into his own courtyard, and the army came with him, and the sound of it filled the valley from wall to wall. But to understand what you are watching, to understand how a boy exiled without a sword or a name became the man who came back with an army and a crown, we must go back. We must go back 17 years to a summer evening in the great hall of Aldenmore, when a dying lord made a declaration that everyone in the room heard, and only one person in the room believed. We must go back to where this began, which was not in a throne room or a battlefield, but in the particular ordinary cruelty of a family deciding what one of its members was worth. It began as so many of history's upheavals begin, with a question of blood. The year was 1173 and legitimacy was everything, not virtue, not ability, not the long, patient work of governing well or fighting honorably, or remembering in the small hours of difficult decisions that the people beneath you in the hierarchy were people. Legitimacy, the question of who had the right to what, by blood and by law and by the public acknowledgement of those with the power to grant or withhold it, was the currency upon which the entire structure of medieval society ran. Without it, a man could be brilliant and brave and beloved and still own nothing, command nothing, become nothing. With it, a man could be weak and stupid and cruel, and still hold a castle, a title, and the loyalty of everyone inside both. This was not a flaw in the system. This was the system. And everyone who lived inside it understood, with the bone-deep clarity of people who have never known anything else, that the rules were not arbitrary. They were load-bearing. Remove them, and everything above them came down. Castle Aldenmore sat in the hill country of the Auvergne, in the central highlands of France, at an elevation that made its winters brutal and its strategic position valuable. It commanded 3 valleys and 2 roads, and a river crossing that had been fought over in 4 separate conflicts in the preceding century, which meant that whoever held Aldenmore held something that other people wanted, which meant that whoever held it needed to hold it carefully, with the full weight of legitimate authority, because the moment that authority appeared questionable, the people who wanted what Aldenmore had would feel the question like blood in the water. Lord Edrin de Aldenmore understood this completely. He had governed the castle and its surrounding lands for 26 years, with the competence of a man who is not naturally gifted, but has worked diligently to compensate, and he had maintained, through those years, a household that was not flourishing but was stable, which in the hill country of the Auvergne in the 12th century was an achievement that deserved more credit than it typically received. He had 2 sons. The first was Cassel, legitimate, born of his marriage to the Lady Mireille de Foix, who had died of fever when Cassel was 7, and who existed in the household's memory as a woman of great gentleness and middling health, remembered most vividly by the servants who had cared for her, and most abstractly by the son who had been too young to fully form her in his mind before she was gone. Cassel de Aldenmore was, at the time this story begins, 28 years old. He was capable, precise, and possessed of the particular self-assurance that comes to men who have always known what they would inherit. He managed the castle's finances with efficiency. He ran the household with order. He was not warm. Warmth had been trained out of him early, by a father who equated sentiment with weakness. But he was fair, in the way that a well-calibrated scale is fair, without feeling. The second son was Edric de Aldenmore, or as the household's formal records listed him, with the bureaucratic cruelty of a system that had precise language for every category of human being. Edric, natural son of Edrin, born of Sarah of the village, was 11 years old at the opening of this story, and did not yet understand, with the full cognitive weight that understanding requires, what he was. He knew he was different. He had always known. The quality of the difference was in the way adults spoke to him versus the way they spoke to Cassel. The angle of it, the slight recalibration that happened in a person's posture and expression and tone when they shifted their attention from the legitimate heir to the other one. He was not mistreated. This is important to say clearly, because the story of a bastard who is beaten and starved is a different story than this one, and a simpler one. Edric was housed and fed and educated alongside his brother, given access to the same tutors, trained in the same skills, allowed to eat at the same table. Lord Edron was not a cruel man in his private conduct. He was a man who had made a mistake, a liaison with a village woman during a difficult year of his marriage, before Mireille's illness had become serious, and who had chosen to acknowledge the result of that mistake rather than pretend it did not exist, which was, by the standards of the era, a form of decency. But decency has limits, and the limit of Lord Edrin's decency was precisely the point at which acknowledging Edric would have cost Cassel something. Edric was, by every measure available to the people who watched both boys grow, the more naturally gifted of the two. This was not a dramatic difference. It was not the difference between a fool and a genius, which would have been easier to dismiss. It was the subtler, more uncomfortable difference between a person of solid competence and a person of genuine talent. Edric learned faster. He remembered longer. He asked better questions and absorbed the answers more completely, and applied what he had learned with a flexibility that the tutors noted, privately, among themselves, and never noted aloud, because noting it aloud would have required someone to then discuss what it meant. He was also, unlike Cassel, liked. Not merely tolerated or respected, liked. By the servants, who are always the most accurate judges of character in any household, because they observe without the distorting effect of wanting something from the person they are observing. By the estate's tenants, who encountered both brothers on the regular rounds of the estate and returned from encounters with Edric, somehow lighter than when they had left. By the soldiers, who trained with both young men, and found in Edric something they rarely found in the sons of lords, the ability to lose gracefully, which is a different and more valuable quality than the ability to win. Cassel was aware of all of this. He was too intelligent not to be, and to his credit, and this must be granted him, as the full truth of a person requires accounting for both what they did wrong and what they managed to sustain alongside it? He did not hate his brother. He feared him. These are not the same thing. Hatred is simple and hot, and ultimately its own destruction. Fear is cold and patient, and if left unaddressed, architectural. It builds itself into the structure of every decision a person makes until the decisions themselves become expressions of the fear rather than responses to the actual world. Cassel feared what Edric represented, the possibility that legitimacy, which was the entire foundation of Cassel's claim to everything, was a legal convention rather than a natural truth. That the castle and the title and the deference of everyone inside both walls were his not because he deserved them, but because he had been born first to the right woman. That if the world were arranged differently, if it ran on merit rather than blood, the outcome would not be the same. This fear was not irrational. It was, in fact, an accurate reading of the situation, which made it worse. The woman who understood all of this most clearly was not Lord Edrin, who was too close to it, or Cassel, who was too implicated in it, or even Edric himself, who was still young enough to believe that the situation might resolve into something livable. The woman who understood it was Marta. Marta was the castle's head of household, what a later era might call a chatelaine, though the word implies more formal recognition than she had ever been given. She was 51 years old, a widow of 15 years, originally from the lowlands near Clermont, who had come to Aldenmoor as a young woman in service to the Lady Mireille, and had simply never left, absorbing the grief of Mireille's death and the complications of Lord Adrian's subsequent household into a practical, unsentimental competence that made her indispensable to everyone and invisible to most of them. She had known Edric since his first day in the castle. She had watched him grow with the particular attention of a woman who cannot have children of her own and does not, therefore, waste the experience of caring for someone else's. She was the one who, on the evening that the dying Lord Edrin summoned his household to the great hall, stood at the back of the room and understood, before the old man had finished speaking, what was about to happen and what it was going to cost. Adron de Aldenmoor died as he had lived, with order and without drama. In his final weeks, when it became clear that the illness compressing his chest was not going to relent, he made his arrangements with the methodical thoroughness of a man settling accounts. He confirmed Castle's inheritance in writing, witnessed by the castle chaplain and 2 neighboring lords. He endowed a small chantry for prayers for his soul. He wrote letters to 3 creditors, and then, on a July evening with the windows open to the summer air and the assembled household standing in the hall below his chair, he did the one thing that everyone in that room had been privately hoping he would not do. He publicly acknowledged Edric. Not as his heir, that was never the question, as his son, by name, by blood. With the specific language of paternal recognition that, in the law of the land, conferred upon Edric not inheritance, but something almost as dangerous in the wrong circumstances. Standing. The right to call himself what he was. The right to the name. He meant it as a gift. He meant it as the correction of an injustice he had maintained for 11 years and could no longer maintain with a clear conscience. He looked at Edric, standing in the hall at 18 years old with his hands quiet at his sides and his face very still, and he said, in the formal language the moment required, the words that gave his son something he had never had. He was dead within the week. The summer continued without him, indifferent and warm, and Cassel de Aldenmoor, who was now Lord of Aldenmoor, and who had stood in that hall and heard his father give his brother a name and understood exactly what a name could become in the hands of a man like Edric, began, in the cold and patient way of a man whose fear had long since become architecture, to plan. He did not move immediately. This was characteristic of him. The refusal to act before the situation was fully prepared, before every contingency was accounted for, before the outcome was as certain as human planning could make it. He waited 4 months. He allowed Edric to settle into the new reality of being publicly acknowledged, to begin to understand what the name meant and what possibilities it opened. He allowed the household to adjust. He allowed the neighboring lords to absorb the information. He allowed time to pass, which is the oldest and most reliable instrument of a certain kind of intention, Then, on a January morning when the ground was iron-hard with frost and the valley below the castle was white and still, he summoned Edric to the great hall. The household was assembled. This was not accidental. What Cassel said in the formal and public language that mirrored his father's declaration with deliberate and devastating precision was this: that the acknowledgement made by the late Lord Edrin, while understood as an expression of personal feeling, had no legal standing in the governance of the estate. That Edric, natural son, held no claim of any kind to the name, the title, or the lands of Aldenmore. That his continued presence in the castle, given the confusion his status might cause in the minds of the estate's tenants and neighbors, was a source of instability that the new lord could not in good conscience allow, and that he was therefore, with appropriate provision for his immediate needs, being asked to leave. The provision for his immediate needs consisted of a wool cloak, a pair of boots, and 3 silver coins. No sword, no horse, no letter of introduction to any lord who might receive him. No use of the Aldenmore name. He was 18 years old. It was January. The frost was on the ground. Marta pushed through the assembled household before the guards could move forward. She pressed something into Edric's hand, small, warm from her palm, something she had clearly been carrying in anticipation of this moment. He looked at it. He looked at her. Whatever passed between them in that look was not witnessed by anyone who later set it down. Then he walked out of the hall, through the courtyard, through the gates, and down the hill into the white valley below, and the gates of Castle Aldenmore closed behind him. Cassel watched from the window of the great hall until the figure in the wool cloak had disappeared into the tree line. Then he turned back to the room, and the household rearranged itself around him the way households do, absorbing the new reality, adjusting to the new gravity, filing away what had happened into the category of things that were now simply true. Only Marta did not adjust. She stood where she had been standing at the edge of the assembled household, looking at the closed gates with the expression of a woman making a very long calculation and arriving at an answer she already knew. She had given him, in that final moment, a small brass medallion that had belonged to the Lady Mireille. On its back, scratched in letters too small to read at a glance, was a name, a single name, a contact in the city of Clermont, a merchant who owed Marta a debt of the kind that accumulates between people who have shared a long and difficult history. It was not a sword. It was not a horse. It was not a letter of introduction to a lord. It was a thread. The thinnest possible thread connecting a boy walking into a January forest to a world that did not yet know he existed. He followed it. The merchant's name was Gobain. He was a broad, careful man of 55 who traded in wool and occasionally in information, which is a combination that has sustained more careers in more centuries than history typically acknowledges. He operated from a narrow building on the commercial street of Clermont that smelled of lanolin and ink and the particular mustiness of a place where papers are kept and consulted rather than displayed. He had known Marta for 30 years, had grown up in the same village outside Clermont, had watched her leave for service at a noble house with the pragmatic admiration of someone who recognizes a good decision when they see one made by someone else. He had received her occasional letters over the years with the faithful attention of a man who understands that maintaining a connection costs very little and pays unpredictably, but sometimes extraordinarily well. When Edric arrived at his door in January, half frozen with the brass medallion in his hand and 3 silver coins in his cloak, and the specific expression of a young man who has been walking for 4 days and has not yet decided whether he is defeated, Gobain looked at him for a long moment and then opened the door wider and said simply, "Come in." He asked 3 questions. Where are you from? What can you do? What do you want? Edric answered the first question carefully, not with a lie but with an omission that was structurally identical to one. He was from the hill country of the Auvergne. He had been in service to a noble household. He was no longer in that service. He answered the second question honestly. He could read and write in Latin and French. He could manage accounts. He could ride and fight at a competent level. He could remember, with unusual accuracy, anything he had been told or had read. He answered the third question after a silence that lasted long enough for Gobain to pour 2 cups of heated wine and set one in front of him. "I want to not be nothing," Edric said. Everything else I can work out from there." Gobain nodded slowly, in the way of a man who has heard many answers to that question and recognizes this one as more honest than most. He offered Edric work, clerk's work initially, the keeping of accounts and the drafting of correspondence, and the management of the inventory that a wool merchant of moderate success required someone to manage. It was not dignified work in the terms that the world Edric came from used to measure dignity. It was, however, work that paid, that housed him in a small room above the warehouse, and that placed him every day in contact with the flow of information that moved through a commercial city in ways that the inhabitants of castles, looking down from their strategic elevations, frequently failed to appreciate. Clermont in 1173 was a city in motion. It sat at the intersection of trade routes that connected the northern markets to the Mediterranean coast, and the traffic that moved through it carried not only goods but news, the kind of granular, specific, commercially useful news that merchants trade alongside their wool and their wine and their salt. Who was buying grain in large quantities, which suggests a garrison preparing for something. Which lord's estate agent had been inquiring about credit terms, which suggests the lord's revenues were not meeting his expenses. Which roads were being repaired and which were being neglected, which tells you something about where power is moving and where it is retreating. Edric absorbed all of it with the same completeness that he had absorbed everything he had ever been taught, and with an additional quality that the castle's tutors had not been in a position to develop in him. The ability to see, in the commercial information flowing through Gobain's warehouse, the political reality that it encoded. He began, within 6 months, to understand the region not as a collection of named estates and titled lords, the map he had grown up with, but as a system of pressures and flows and dependencies that the lords themselves frequently did not fully grasp, because they were too close to their own positions to see the whole. Gobain noticed. Gobain was, above all things, a noticer. "You see it like a merchant," the older man told him one evening, over the account books. "But you think about it like a soldier." "I was trained by both," Edric said. "Yes." Gobain looked at him with the steady, evaluating attention he turned on anything he was considering investing in. "The question is what you intend to do with the combination." What Edric intended, what he had been constructing, in the privacy of the small room above the warehouse, through the long winter nights when Clermont was quiet and he was not revenge. This is important to establish clearly, because the story of a dispossessed bastard who burns with revenge is a familiar one, and this is not that story, or not simply that story, which is a different and more interesting thing. What he was constructing was a case. He had been publicly stripped of a name that had been publicly given to him, in front of witnesses by a lord whose right to give it was not in legal dispute. The acknowledgement Lord Edrin had made in that summer hall was not a private sentiment. It was a formal declaration, witnessed and recorded in the household's own documents. Cassell's subsequent reversal of that declaration, whatever its political justifications, rested on legal ground that was, in the ecclesiastical law of the period, considerably less solid than Cassell believed or had been advised. Edric had read enough, had absorbed enough of the documents that passed through Gobain's hands, many of which concerned property disputes and inheritance questions, and the complex legal aftermath of noble deaths, to understand that what had been done to him was not merely unjust in the human sense. It was legally questionable in a way that could, under the right circumstances, before the right authority, with the right evidence, be challenged. He needed 3 things. He needed time. He needed resources. And he needed someone with standing in the world of lords and law who would take the case seriously enough to pursue it. The time he had. The resources he began to build, slowly, through the combination of his clerk's salary and a small percentage of the commercial intelligence he provided to Gobain, that proved, on several occasions, to be worth considerably more than either of them had initially estimated. The third thing, the person with standing, arrived in Clermont in the autumn of 1174 in a way that Edric, who had by then learned to treat coincidence with the skepticism it deserves, did not initially trust. His name was Father Anselm. He was a canon lawyer of the Diocese of Clermont, a precise, energetic man of 40 who had spent 20 years navigating the labyrinthine intersection of church law and secular inheritance disputes, and who had developed, through that navigation, a profound and genuine irritation with the frequency with which powerful men used legal ambiguity to do things that were clearly wrong. He was not a revolutionary. He was not even, in most senses, a reformer. He was something more specific and, in the long run, more effective. A man who had chosen a narrow lane of expertise and was absolutely relentless within it. He came to Gobain's warehouse in connection with a wool contract dispute that had acquired ecclesiastical dimensions through a chain of circumstances too convoluted to fully recount. Edric managed the documentation for Gobain's side of the case. Anselm, reviewing the materials, made a comment about the quality of the filing that was not quite a compliment, but close enough. Edric responded with a question about a point of canon law that surprised the priest into a longer answer than he had intended to give. They ended up talking for 3 hours. Anselm left with the wool dispute resolved and an appointment to return the following week, which became a habit, which became something neither of them would have called a friendship in the formal language of their respective positions, but which was, in every functional sense, exactly that. Edric waited 8 months before telling him about Aldenmore. He told it without drama, which was by then characteristic of him. He had learned, in the years since January, that the facts of his situation were sufficiently stark to carry their own weight without theatrical assistance. He laid out the acknowledgement, the reversal, the morning in January, the wool cloak and the 3 silver coins, and the absence of a sword or a horse or a name. He presented the legal question as a legal question, not as a personal injury, because he had thought carefully about which framing was more likely to produce the response he needed. Anselm listened without interrupting. When Edric finished, the priest was quiet for a long moment. He had the specific expression of a man whose professional interest and personal conscience are pointing in the same direction and who is deciding how much of each to acknowledge. "The acknowledgement by Lord Edrin," he said carefully. "It was witnessed by the chaplain and the assembled household, approximately 40 people. And the reversal by the current lord, was it witnessed with equivalent formality?" "It was public. Whether it met the canonical standard for reversing a formal paternal acknowledgement is—" "It does not," Anselm said flatly. "Under current church doctrine, a paternal acknowledgement made formally and in the presence of witnesses carries a legal weight that cannot be unilaterally revoked by a subsequent lord, regardless of that lord's secular authority over the estate." He paused. "Whether a secular court would honor that doctrine in a case where the secular and ecclesiastical interests conflict is a different question, which is why I need an ecclesiastical advocate," Edric said. Anselm looked at him for a long time. "You've been building toward this conversation for 8 months." "Yes." "You could have raised it sooner." "I needed you to know me first," Edric said simply. "The case is sound. But a sound case argued by a stranger is weaker than a sound case argued by someone who has had time to evaluate the character of the person making it." Anselm was quiet again. Then something shifted in his expression, a precise contained amusement at the architecture of what had just been revealed to him. "You are," he said, "either the most patient young man I have ever met, or the most calculating one." "Both, I think," Edric said. "They're not mutually exclusive." It took 2 more years to build the case to the point where it could be presented. 2 years during which Edric continued to work for Gobain, continued to accumulate resources, continued to learn the geography of power in the region, with the systematic thoroughness of a man drawing a map he intends to travel. He wrote letters, careful, precisely worded letters, to 3 men who had been present in the great hall on the summer evening, when Lord Edrin had made his declaration, asking them to set down in writing, witnessed and sealed, what they had heard. 2 of them responded. One of those responses was legally useful. He made contact through Gobain's network with a lord in the northern Auvergne named Bertrand de Sceaux, who had a long-standing territorial dispute with Castel de Aldenmore over a river crossing that Castel had been quietly taxing beyond the agreed rate for 3 years. Lord Bertrand was not a sentimental man. He was, however, a practical one who understood that the legitimacy of a neighboring lord's title was a matter of direct relevance to his own interests. He received Edric's letter. He considered it for 2 weeks. He wrote back, The letter from Lord Bertrand was not a promise of military support. It was a statement of interest, measured, non-committal, precisely the kind of language that a cautious man uses when he wants to indicate that the door is open without stepping through it himself. But it was the first letter. It established the first connection. And Edric, who had learned to read the coded language of political correspondence with the same fluency that Gobain's accounts had taught him to read commercial flow, understood what it meant. He was no longer a young man walking into a January forest. He was becoming something else, something that had no name yet because the world had not yet seen it, but that the people around him were beginning to sense the way you can sense the shape of something in a dark room before your eyes have adjusted enough to see it clearly. The thing that broke the careful architecture of his patience was not a legal development or a political one. It was a letter from Marta. She had been sending occasional letters through Gobain's address since the first year. Brief, practical, informative. The letters of a woman who is gathering intelligence for someone she has decided to invest in without ever using language that would make that investment visible to anyone intercepting the correspondence. They described the state of the castle's household with the neutral tone of a steward's report, which meant that to anyone else reading them, they were entirely innocuous, and to Edric, they were precise and detailed accounts of everything that mattered. The letter that arrived in the spring of 1177 was different in tone. Not in language, Marta was too careful for that, but in what it described. The castle was in difficulty. The river-crossing revenues, which Cassel had been inflating, and which Lord Bertrand's complaint had now brought under formal scrutiny, had created a legal dispute that was consuming resources. 3 of the estate's senior knights had left service, 1 had died, 2 had accepted commissions elsewhere. The tenants in the northern valley had sent a formal petition of grievance regarding the harvest assessments, which meant they were unhappy enough to put it in writing, which in the hierarchy of tenant discontent was a significant escalation. Cassel was governing with his customary precision and without anything resembling warmth, and the household was running efficiently and was not, in any sense that mattered, well. And then in the final paragraph, in language so carefully neutral it could have been a comment about the weather, the chaplain who had witnessed the late Lord Edrin's acknowledgment had retired to a monastery near Issoire, where he was understood to be in good health and good memory, and had expressed in a recent conversation that Marta did not specify the details of, a feeling that there were things from his years at Aldenmore that perhaps deserved a proper accounting before God.
Edric read this paragraph 3 times. Then he went to find Father Anselm. The case, they agreed, was ready. What was not yet ready, what Edric had been building toward with every letter and every contact and every carefully maintained relationship over the past 4 years, was the condition in which the case could be presented not merely before a church court, where it might succeed legally and produce nothing practically, but before the secular power that governed the region, the Count of Auvergne, whose authority superseded both Castle's lordship and Bertrand's territorial claims, and whose court was the only venue in which a ruling on the name and standing of Edric d'Aldenmore would carry the force to actually matter. Getting before the Count's court required an advocate with standing. Anselm had standing in the church. He did not have standing at the Count's court, which was a secular matter. Lord Bertrand did. Edric rode north in May to meet him in person for the first time. He had been preparing for this meeting for 2 years, not in the sense of rehearsing speeches, but in the deeper sense of understanding precisely what Bertrand needed, what he feared, what he wanted from an alliance, and what he would consider an unacceptable risk. He arrived at Bertrand's hall on a Tuesday morning, road-worn, without ceremony, and Bertrand, a compact gray-haired man with the watchful eyes of someone who had survived 20 years of the Count's court by being very good at assessing people quickly, looked at him across the table and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're younger than I expected." "I'm 22, Edric said. "But I've been working on this since I was 18, and the case is sound. I believe Lord Bertrand is a man who prefers to be on the correct side of a legal determination before that determination is made rather than after." Bertrand looked at him for another moment, and he said, "Tell me what you need." What Edric needed, he explained, was not Bertrand's sword. Not yet. He needed Bertrand's name, his formal sponsorship of the petition to the Count's court, which would elevate the matter from the complaint of a landless bastard to a case brought by a legitimate lord with a deaxylate and a legitimate lord, with a direct interest in the Oldenmore title question. In exchange, Edric was prepared to offer a written commitment, legally binding, that in the event of a successful resolution of his claim, the river crossing revenues would be assessed at the agreed historical rate, and the 3 years of overcharging would be reconciled. It was, Bertrand acknowledged, a fair offer. More than fair, it was the offer of a man who understood that alliances require both parties to gain something, which was a level of political maturity that he had not consistently encountered in men twice Edric's age. He agreed. The petition was filed with the Count of Auvergne's court in the summer of 1177. It cited the canonical doctrine on paternal acknowledgement, the witness testimony of the summer hall, the written depositions of the 2 men who had responded to Edric's letters, and the statement of the retired chaplain at Issoire, which Anselm had ridden personally to collect, and which was, in its precise and quietly devastating account of what Lord Edron had said and what it had meant, the strongest single document in the case. Castle de Oldenmore received notice of the petition in August. He read it in the great hall of the castle his father had built, and his father had given a name to a man he was now trying to erase from the record. And when he finished reading it, he set it down on the table very carefully and looked out the window at the valley below for a long time. He had not expected this. Not the legal precision of it, not the allies behind it, not the 4 years of patient, invisible construction that had produced from a boy with a wool cloak and 3 silver coins. A petition that now sat on his table bearing the seal of Lord Bertrand de Sceaux and the endorsement of a canon lawyer of the Diocese of Clermont. He had made in the January morning 4 years ago, when he had stripped his brother of a name and sent him into a frost-hard valley with nothing, a calculation. The calculation had been that a bastard without resources, without allies, without even a name to open doors with, would dissipate, would be absorbed into the vast, anonymous population of landless men that the medieval world produced in such quantities that one more was simply invisible. He had been wrong, and the particular quality of his wrongness, the fact that it was his own underestimation of exactly the qualities he had feared that had produced the threat he was now facing, was not lost on him as he stood at the window of his hall, looking down at the valley that had always been his, and feeling for the first time the specific vertigo of a man whose certainty has developed a crack. He summoned his advisers. He began to prepare his response. The war, the real war, the one without swords, the one that would determine everything, had begun.
Cassel's response to the petition arrived at the Count's court in October, and it was, by every measure of legal craftsmanship available in the 12th century, formidable. He had not been idle in the 2 months since the notice arrived. He had retained the services of a secular advocate of considerable reputation, a man named Ferrand, who had argued cases before the Count's court for 15 years, and who had in that time developed an expertise in the specific legal mechanisms by which inconvenient claims could be delayed, complicated, and ultimately exhausted through the sheer attrition of process. Ferrand was not a dishonest man in the way that men who take money to argue positions they know to be false are dishonest. He was the more common and more comfortable variety, a man who had long since made his peace with the fact that his skill was available to whoever could pay for it, and who had constructed around this accommodation a philosophy that held, not entirely without logic, that the adversarial process itself was the guarantor of justice, and that therefore representing the stronger party was not a moral problem, but a structural feature. The response he crafted was built on 3 pillars. The first was procedural. It challenged the standing of Lord Bertrand as a sponsor on the grounds that his interest in the river crossing revenues created a conflict that disqualified him from the role of disinterested advocate. This was a thin argument, and Ferrand knew it, but thin arguments served a purpose in legal proceedings. They required response, which required time, which was itself a resource that one party to a dispute typically had more of than the other. The second pillar was evidentiary. It challenged the depositions of the 2 witnesses to Lord Edron's acknowledgement on the grounds that both men had subsequently accepted hospitality from parties connected to the petition, which created a question of bias. This was somewhat less thin. One of the 2 witnesses had, in fact, had dinner twice with a merchant in Gobain's network, which Castle's people had apparently investigated with more thoroughness than Edric had anticipated. The third pillar was the one that kept Edric awake at night. It was a document, a single piece of parchment, produced from the Aldenmore household records, bearing the late Lord Edrin's seal, that purported to be a private letter written 6 weeks after the public acknowledgement in the summer hall, in which Edrin expressed regret at the public declaration and indicated his intention to clarify, before his death, that the acknowledgement was a personal expression of paternal feeling and not intended to carry legal weight. The letter was either genuine or it was not. If it was genuine, it materially complicated the case. If it was not, if it had been produced after the fact, backdated, the seal applied to a document that Edrin had never actually written, then it was fraud committed upon the Count's court, which was a serious matter. But proving that it was fraudulent required demonstrating either that the handwriting was not Edrin's, or that the seal had been improperly applied, or that the paper itself was inconsistent with the period, and all of these demonstrations required expertise and time and access to comparative materials that Edric did not readily have. He sat with this problem for 3 days. Father Anselm sat with it alongside him, and the quality of the priest's silence during those 3 days, the focused, unhappy silence of a man who has encountered something he cannot immediately resolve, told Edric more about the seriousness of the obstacle than any explicit assessment would have. On the 4th day, Edric went back to the beginning. He went back specifically to the retired chaplain at Issoire, the man who had witnessed the acknowledgement and whose deposition was, of the documents they had assembled, the one Cassel had not directly challenged. He rode there himself, 4 days south, arriving in late October when the leaves were coming down from the chestnut trees that lined the monastery's approach road in long, slow drifts. The chaplain's name was Father Rule. He was 73 years old, small and deliberate in his movements, with the particular clarity that sometimes settles over very old people who have given up the maintenance of pretense as an unnecessary expenditure of energy. He received Edric in the monastery's small garden, bundled against the October cold, and he looked at the young man across the stone table between them, with eyes that were still, despite everything, sharp. "You came about the letter," Rule said, before Edric had finished explaining why he was there. Edric went very still. "You know about it." "I know that a man came to see me 6 weeks ago," Rule said, asking questions about the late lord's habits of correspondence and the form of his private seal. He paused. "I did not answer those questions, but I understood why they were being asked." "The letter is false," Edric said. It was not quite a question. Rule was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the chestnut trees. A bell rang somewhere in the monastery behind them. "Lord Edrin called me to his bedside the night before he died," the old priest said finally. "He made his confession. What was said in that confession I cannot disclose. The seal of the confessional is absolute, and I will not break it, not for you, not for any court, not for any earthly authority." He paused again. "But I can tell you this, and it is not a violation of anything I am bound to protect. Lord Edrin did not ask me in that final night to help him draft any correspondence. And I was with him for 6 hours, and no one else was admitted to his chamber after I arrived. The letter, in other words, had been written and sealed after Edrin was already under the chaplain's sole attendance, which meant it had been written and sealed by someone other than Edrin, using materials and seals that were available to the household after the Lord's death. It could not be proven in court without Rule testifying to the timeline of that final night. Rule could not testify to the content of the confession, but the timeline itself, when he arrived, how long he stayed, who was admitted, was not protected by the confessional seal. It was simply fact. "Will you testify to the timeline?" Edric asked. Rule looked at him steadily. "I have been asking myself that question since the man came to visit me 6 weeks ago. Whether I owed anything to a dead lord's memory. Whether I owed anything to the living household that I served for 12 years. Whether I owed anything to the truth, which is an obligation that does not have a simple hierarchy." He looked down at his hands on the stone table. "I am 73 years old. I have not many more seasons of decisions left to make. I would like, when I present my accounting, to have made the important ones correctly." "I'll take that as a yes," Edric said quietly. "Take it however you need to. the old man said. But understand something. He looked up again, and in his eyes was the specific gravity of someone about to say something they have carried for a long time. Your father loved you. The public acknowledgement was not sentiment, and it was not guilt. It was his most considered decision, made when he knew he was dying and had no more incentive to choose comfort over truth. He knew what it would cost. He chose you anyway. He paused. I think you should know that. Whatever the court decides, whatever happens after, that was real, and it was his, and no document produced after his death can unmake it. Edric rode back to Claremont in a condition he did not entirely have language for. He had what he needed, the testimony that would neutralize the fraudulent letter. He had something else that he had not expected to need, and that he found, in the long days of riding through the autumn countryside, considerably harder to carry than any legal document. He had his father, not a living father that was long past, but a father who had chosen him clearly, deliberately, with full understanding of the cost, in the last real decision of his life. This was not the same as what Edric had lost in January, which was a name and a position and a future. It was something older and deeper and more personal than any of those things, and sitting with it in the cold of the autumn road required a kind of interior adjustment that took more miles than he had expected. He was 22 years old. He had been operating for 4 years on the fuel of purpose and patience and the clean, sustaining energy of a clearly defined goal. He had managed, in that time, to keep the personal dimension of the injury. The boy who had walked out of his home on a January morning, compartmentalized, set aside, accessible only in controlled amounts and only when necessary. The old priest had, with 9 quiet sentences in a monastery garden, opened that compartment. He rode hard the last 2 days and arrived back in Claremont lean and tired and more ready than he had been before. The hearing before the Count of Auvergne's court was scheduled for the following March. Cassel, informed of Father Roule's willingness to testify on the question of timeline, made 2 further moves in the months between October and March that revealed, to Edric and to Anselm and to Lord Bertrand, who was following events from his northern estate with the attentive neutrality of a man managing a significant investment, the full shape of what they were dealing with. The first move was an attempt to have Father Roule's testimony excluded on jurisdictional grounds, arguing that a clergyman's testimony in a secular court, on matters arising from his priestly duties, required episcopal approval that had not been obtained. It was a clever argument, technically defensible, and it consumed 6 weeks of correspondence between Anselm and the diocesan office before the bishop ruled, with visible irritation at having been drawn into a secular inheritance dispute through a side door, that the testimony in question did not arise from priestly duties and was therefore not subject to episcopal review. The second move was directed not at the case but at Edric personally. In January of 1178, 5 years almost to the day after the morning in the frost, Edric received a visitor at Gobain's warehouse. He was a young man, well-dressed, with the specific manner of someone carrying a message he has been instructed to deliver in a particular way. He presented, with careful neutrality, an offer from the Lord of Aldenmore. The offer was this. Cassel d'Aldenmore would acknowledge, privately and without legal record, that the original acknowledgement by Lord Edrin had been validly made. He would provide Edric with a sum of money, substantial, specific, enough to establish a man of modest ambitions comfortably for life, and a letter of introduction to a lord in the Languedoc, who was known to receive capable men of ambiguous background without undue scrutiny. In exchange, Edric would withdraw the petition, release Lord Bertrand from his sponsorship, and agree to make no further claim of any kind against the estate or the name of Aldenmore. The messenger delivered all of this, and then waited, with the professional patience of someone who has been told the offer is generous and genuinely believes it. Edric looked at the letter that accompanied the verbal offer. He looked at the sum. He thought about Gobain's warehouse and the small room above it, and 5 years of clerk's work and cold winter mornings, and the road to Issoire, and the old priest's hands on the stone table, and 9 sentences that had opened something he had not known was closed. He looked at the messenger. "Tell my brother," he said, and the word landed in the room with the particular weight of something that had been kept back for a long time, and was now simply, irrevocably out. That what he is offering me is what he should have given me 5 years ago instead of a wool cloak. He had his chance to resolve this with generosity. He chose January instead. I will see him in March. The messenger left. Gobain, who had been present throughout, said nothing for a long moment. Then, that was either very brave or very foolish. Those are not mutually exclusive either, Edric said. He was smiling, which surprised him. He had not expected to be smiling. Get me a cup of wine. I need to write to Father Anselm. March came with the slow, reluctant arrival of a season that has been postponed too long. The Count of Auvergne's court convened in the great hall of the Count's residence in Riom on a Tuesday morning that was cold and bright, with the specific clarity of a day that has decided to be witnessed. The room was fuller than a routine legal proceeding would have required. Word had traveled, through the networks of lords and clergy and merchants and servants that constitute, in aggregate, the actual nervous system of a medieval society, that the Aldenmore case was something worth attending. There were 12 observers of sufficient standing to have claimed seats. There were clerks and advocates on both sides of the central table. There was Father Anselm, who had prepared for this morning with the meticulous thoroughness of a man who has chosen a fight and intends to win it. There was Lord Bertrand, present in person for the first time, his gray eyes moving across the room with the evaluative attention of a man auditing his investment. And there was Cassel de Aldenmore, who had ridden 2 days to be here, who sat across the table from his brother for the first time in 5 years, and who looked, not broken, not frightened, because he was not a man who broke or frightened easily, but like a man who has arrived at a reckoning he prepared for and still finds, in the moment of its arrival, heavier than preparation had led him to expect. Edric looked at him once at the beginning, before the proceedings formally opened. He looked at him with the direct, level attention of a man who has spent 5 years building toward this moment and is not going to waste it on the performance of either contempt or triumph. Castle held the look for 3 seconds. Then he looked away first. The hearing lasted 2 days. On the first day, Ferron argued the procedural and evidentiary objections with the professional skill of a man who knows the ground is shifting, but is determined to contest every inch of it. On the second day, Father Rule testified. He was brought into the hall supported by a young monk from the monastery, and he sat at the witness table with his hands folded and his eyes clear, and he described, in the careful, precise language of a man who has rehearsed the difference between what he can say and what he cannot, the timeline of Lord Edrin's final night. The arrival time, the duration, the names of those admitted and those turned away, the condition of the Lord's correspondence materials, which had been present in the room and which Rule had noted, with the habitual attention of a careful man, were not disturbed during his attendance. When Ferron cross-examined him, Rule answered each question with the unhurried patience of a 73-year-old man who has nothing left to be intimidated by, and who has decided, at the end of a long life of small accommodations to institutional convenience, to be, in this one matter, entirely and inflexibly honest. The fraudulent letter was ruled inadmissible. Without it, Castle's case rested on the procedural objections and the weakened evidentiary challenges, neither of which the Count's legal advisers indicated in their consultation with the Count on the evening of the second day was sufficient to overcome the documented weight of the original acknowledgment and the canonical doctrine that Anselm had argued with the precision of someone who had been preparing the argument for 3 years. The Count of Auvergne rendered his judgment on the morning of the third day. Edric de Aldenmore, the name formally used in the ruling for the first time in a legal document, with the full patronymic that had been publicly given and publicly stripped and was now publicly restored, was recognized as the legitimate acknowledged son of the late Lord Edrin de Aldenmore. His legal standing as a recognized member of the Aldenmore bloodline was confirmed. The question of inheritance of the estate itself, which was a separate and more complex matter involving established succession law that favored the legitimate line, was not resolved by the ruling and would require further proceedings. It was not everything. Edric had not expected everything. He had expected this: the name, the standing, the legal recognition that he existed in the way that the world of lords and law recognized existence, and he received it in the great hall of the Count's court on a March morning, with the composure of a man who has been working toward a specific destination for 5 years and has arrived at it exactly as planned, and finds, in the moment of arrival, that it is both exactly what he expected and nothing like what he imagined. What he had not planned for, what no calculation had prepared him for, was what happened after the judgment was read. He looked across the table at Exile. His brother was sitting very still. The composure was intact. Castle's composure was, Edric had always known, genuinely remarkable, a thing built over years and maintained through conditions that would have fractured lesser constructions. But beneath it, in the set of the jaw and the particular stillness of his hands and something around the eyes that only someone who had grown up watching that face could read, was the full weight of what had just happened. Exile had lost. Not the estate, not yet, but the argument that had justified everything. He had sent his brother into the frost on the premise that the acknowledgement was legally void. The court had just ruled that it was not. Everything that had followed from that January morning, the wool cloak and the 3 silver coins and the gates closing on a boy with nothing, was now, in the language of the law, a wrong. Edric had not planned for what he felt when he saw that. He had expected satisfaction. He found something considerably more complicated, the recognition, arriving with the clarity that certain truths arrive with when they are no longer deniable, that Exile was not a monster. He was a frightened man who had made a monstrous decision, which is a different thing, and one that the simple architecture of triumph does not accommodate. He was not ready to forgive him. He was not certain he ever would be. But he looked at his brother across the table in the Count's court, with the judgment freshly read and the name freshly restored, and he thought about Lord Edrin on his deathbed choosing him, and about the old priest in the monastery garden, and about 5 years of small rooms and cold mornings and the patient, invisible work of becoming something from nothing. He stood. He gathered his documents. He nodded to Father Anselm, who returned the nod with the restrained satisfaction of a man whose argument has prevailed. He nodded to Lord Bertrand, who was already calculating the implications for the river-crossing revenues with the brisk efficiency of a man separating personal from professional. He did not nod to Exile. He looked at him once more briefly, and then he turned and walked out of the hall into the March morning, where the light was coming down cold and clean on the cobblestones of Riem, and where Gobain was waiting at the edge of the square with 2 horses and an expression of carefully suppressed delight. "Well," the merchant said. "We have the name," Edric said. He stood for a moment in the March light, feeling the weight and the complexity of everything that had just been gained and everything that had not yet been resolved. Now we need the rest. The rest took 4 more years. This is the part of the story that the chronicles, the ones that exist, the fragments preserved in monastery libraries and episcopal archives and the administrative records of the Count of Auvergne's court, compress into a paragraph or omit entirely, because chronicles are written by men who understand climax and do not always understand the long, unglamorous work that produces it. 4 years of legal proceedings and political maneuvering, and the patient cultivation of alliances that would have collapsed under pressure if they had been built any faster. 4 years during which Edric de Aldenmore became, in the estimation of the lords and clergy and merchants of the Auvergne, something that none of them had a precise category for and all of them were paying close attention to. He was not a lord. The estate ruling had confirmed his name and his standing, but had explicitly deferred the inheritance question, which meant that Exile retained the castle and the lands and the revenues, while the legal proceedings continued their slow, expensive, adversarial progress. He was not a knight in the formal sense. He had been trained in the skills, but had never been formally invested, because formal investiture required a lord willing to perform the ceremony, and the lord most naturally positioned to do so had sent him into a frost-covered valley with 3 silver coins. He was not a merchant, though he had learned more about commerce than most merchants twice his age. He was not a clergyman, though Father Anselm had taught him to navigate ecclesiastical law with a fluency that most laymen never achieved. He was, in the precise and limiting language of the medieval world, a man of acknowledged blood and unresolved status, which is another way of saying that he was exactly dangerous enough to be worth knowing, and not yet powerful enough to be worth fearing, which is, historically, the most productive position a person can occupy when they are trying to build something. He built. The foundation was the legal case, which Anselm continued to advance through the ecclesiastical courts in parallel with the secular proceedings. The walls were the alliances. Lord Bertrand, whose river-crossing situation had been satisfactorily resolved and who had quietly mentioned the Aldenmore matter to two other lords with adjacent interests. A bishop in the western Auvergne who had been following the canonical dimension of the case with professional interest, and whose support, expressed in the form of a letter to the Count's legal advisers, carried weight disproportionate to its length, and Gobain, who had by now elevated the relationship from employer and employee to something that functioned, in practical terms, as a partnership, providing through his commercial network a flow of information and resources that Edric could not have assembled independently. The roof, the thing that would make everything else permanent, was the one element Edric had not yet secured, and could not secure through legal argument or political alliance alone. He needed the Count. Not the Count's court, which he had already navigated successfully. The Count himself, his personal recognition, his active endorsement, the weight of his authority thrown not merely behind a legal ruling, but behind the man the ruling had named. Without that, the restored name was a legal fact that Cassel could continue to contest through process indefinitely, bleeding both parties of resources until one of them ran out. The Count of Auvergne, his name was Guillaume, and he had held the county for 18 years with the pragmatic competence of a man who has inherited a complicated situation and made his peace with the fact that resolving it completely is not available to him, was not an easy man to access directly. He was surrounded, as counts are, by layers of advisors and advocates and supplicants whose competing interests created, around the Count himself, a kind of institutional weather system that had to be navigated before you reached the man at its center. Edric had been studying that weather system for 2 years when the opportunity arrived, in the form that opportunities most commonly take in medieval politics. It arrived as a crisis belonging to someone else. In the summer of 1180, the mountain passes in the eastern Auvergne became the site of a sustained campaign of road banditry that was significantly more organized than ordinary brigandage and significantly less organized than an actual military operation, which meant it was almost certainly being backed by someone with resources and strategic intent, but deniable enough that no one could formally accuse anyone of anything. 3 merchant convoys had been attacked. A minor lord's grain shipment had been seized. The Count's road revenues from the eastern passes were down 30%, which was the kind of number that produces urgent conversations in halls of power. Gobain's network had been tracking the pattern of the attacks for 6 weeks before anyone in the Count's administration had assembled the data into a coherent picture. Edric had assembled it in 3 days, because he had learned from 5 years of working with commercial information that the shape of a disruption tells you as much about its origin as any single piece of evidence, and the shape of this disruption, the specific roads targeted, the specific goods taken, the specific goods left behind, pointed with uncomfortable clarity toward a lord in the northeastern corner of the county, whose territorial ambitions had been a source of low-level friction with the Count's administration for years. He wrote it up. Not a letter. A document. Comprehensive, sourced, organized with the same precision that had impressed Father Anselm 7 years earlier in a warehouse in Clermont, laying out the evidence, the pattern, the probable actor, and 3 possible responses in ascending order of decisiveness. He gave it to Gobain to pass through whatever channel would get it to the Count's attention, with the least possible dilution by intermediaries. It reached Guillaume directly. He read it in an afternoon. He summoned the author the following morning. The meeting lasted 3 hours, which was 2 hours and 40 minutes longer than the Count's secretary had allocated for it when he wrote it into the schedule. Guillaume was, in person, a different man than his institutional role suggested. Quieter, more curious, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades listening to men tell them what they want to hear and have developed, as a consequence, an acute sensitivity to the texture of honest speech. He asked questions that were more penetrating than Edric had anticipated. He was answered with more precision than he was accustomed to receiving. At the end of the 3 hours, he did something that no one in his administration could afterward quite account for in terms of established procedure. He invited Edric to remain in Ryam, at the Count's expense for 30 days, in an advisory capacity that had no formal name and no established precedent, but that amounted in practice to the Count wanting to continue the conversation. Edric stayed for 63 days. At the end of it, Gillam had resolved the banditry situation through a combination of the military pressure that Edric's analysis had made possible to apply precisely and a diplomatic communication to the northeastern lord that was firm enough to be understood without being inflammatory enough to require a formal response, and had formed, with the young man from Aldenmore, the kind of working relationship that forms between people of complementary intelligence when they are placed in proximity to a shared problem. He also, in a private meeting on the 62nd day, told Edric something. The inheritance case, Gilhem said, was going to take years more through the established courts, and might ultimately produce a ruling that was legally correct and practically unenforceable, because the estate's established operations under Cassell's administration had created dependencies, tenants, knights, creditors, neighbors, that a legal transfer of title alone could not simply override without disruption that would harm everyone inside the walls. The law was one path to Aldenmore. It was not the only path. He said this carefully, as a man who is not quite making an offer says something carefully. Edric heard it as a man who has been listening very carefully for 7 years. Here's something. "What is the other path?" he asked. Gilhem looked at him with the evaluative attention of a man taking a final measurement before committing to a construction. "Demonstrate that you can hold it," he said. "Not in court, in the field." The context was this. The county had a military problem developing on its southern border, where the competing claims of 2 minor lords had produced a situation that was trending toward open conflict, and that the Count lacked the personal military resources to address without drawing down forces he needed elsewhere. It required someone capable of negotiating a resolution under the implicit threat of force, which required both the diplomatic sophistication to construct an agreement both parties could accept and the military credibility to make the threat of force convincing. It was, Gillam indicated, the kind of commission he would normally give to a trusted lord of established standing. He was indicating that he was prepared to give it to Edric instead. "If I resolve it," Edric said. "If you resolve it," the Count said, "you will have demonstrated, in a manner visible to every lord in this county, that you are capable of exercising the functions of the office you are claiming, which changes the conversation about Aldenmore considerably." It was not a promise. It was a door, and the door was open. And what was required to walk through it was exactly the thing that Edric had been building toward without knowing its precise shape. Not a legal argument, not a political alliance, but the concrete, public, undeniable demonstration of what he was. He accepted the commission. What followed was the most difficult 3 months of Edric's life, which is a statement that carries weight given the competition it faces from January and everything after. The 2 lords on the southern border, one an old man defending what he saw as his ancestral right, one a younger man with legitimate grievances and insufficient patience, were not amenable to the kind of negotiation that proceeds smoothly and concludes neatly. They were amenable to the kind that proceeds through 14 separate conversations over 11 weeks, in which the same arguments are made in different orders and at different temperatures until the human beings having them have exhausted their capacity to maintain the positions they arrived with and have arrived, through sheer conversational attrition, at something they can both inhabit. Edric was patient. He had been patient for 7 years. 3 more months was not a new skill. It was the application of an existing one. He also, midway through the 11th week, did something that was not in any negotiating strategy he had constructed in advance. The younger lord, his name was Arnaud, 29, with a legitimate claim to a river meadow that the older lord's estate had been using without acknowledgement for 40 years, arrived at a meeting in a condition that was clearly not entirely sober, and that suggested the weight of the situation had become, over the preceding weeks, genuinely difficult to bear. Edric dismissed the assistants and clerks from the room and sat with Arnaud alone for an hour, and what passed between them in that hour was not negotiation and not strategy, but something simpler and more primary. Two young men, roughly the same age, one of them talking about what it cost to fight for something that should have been acknowledged without a fight, and the other one listening in the specific way that a person listens when they recognize what is being said from the inside. Arnaud agreed to the terms the following morning. The older lord, informed that his counterpart had agreed, accepted within the week with the resigned practicality of a man who had been waiting to see who would move first. Edric sent his report to the count. Guillaume read it. He wrote back in his own hand, not through a secretary, a letter of commendation that was specific about what had been achieved and how, and that was, in its specificity, a public document in the sense that things written by counts are public. They are seen, copied, discussed, assessed. The lords of the Auvergne who had been watching the Aldenmore case with the interested neutrality of people who had not yet decided which way to orient themselves, read the count's letter about Edric de Aldenmore, and began, with the quiet, collective recalibration of people adjusting to new information, to adjust. Then Marta's letter arrived. She had continued writing throughout, the steady, informative, carefully neutral correspondence of a woman maintaining a thread across a long distance and a long time. But this letter was different in the way that the letter 4 years earlier had been different, and Edric recognized the difference in the first 3 sentences. Cassel was ill. The nature of the illness was not specified. Marta was too careful to put a medical assessment in writing, but the implication was clear in the compressed, deliberate language of someone who has very little space in a letter and has chosen each word for maximum information. He had been confined to his chamber for 6 weeks. The household was being administered by his steward with the controlled anxiety of a household that understands its situation, is contingent. The 2 neighboring lords who had previously been content to wait on the outcome of the legal proceedings had each, in the past month, sent inquiries to the Count's court regarding the current status of the Aldenmore succession question. They were circling. Edric sat with this letter for a long time, in the same small room above Gobain's warehouse where he had sat with Marta's letters for 9 years, and he felt something that he had not expected to feel, and that required, when it arrived, a period of quiet reckoning to fully understand. He felt afraid for Cassel, not politically afraid, not the strategic concern about what Cassel's incapacity meant for the situation, which was a real concern and one he would address. Something more basic and more uncomfortable than that. The same bone-deep recognition that had arrived in the monastery garden when Father Roule had opened the compartment. The recognition that the human being on the other side of this was not an abstraction, or an obstacle, or even an antagonist in the clean narrative sense, but his brother, from whom he had been separated by a January morning and 7 years, and a wool cloak, and 3 silver coins, and the full weight of everything that had followed. But his brother nonetheless. He wrote to Father Anselm. He wrote to Lord Bertrand, he wrote to Gobain, he wrote last and most carefully to the Count. The letter was short. It was not a legal document, it was not a negotiating position. It contained 2 things, an acknowledgement that Cassel was unwell, and an offer, conditional on nothing, attached to no demand, to come to Aldenmore and to speak with him directly before the situation was resolved by the advancing legal process, or by the neighboring lords who were already beginning to calculate what an uncontested Aldenmore might be worth to them. The response took 12 days, which was long enough that Edric had begun to believe there would be no response. When it came, it was a single sentence, written in Cassel's own hand, which was recognizable after all the years by its characteristic precision and slight rightward lean. Edric rode north in November, and the leaves were down from the chestnut trees, and the road was cold, and he had no army and no escort and no document in his satchel that would help him if this went wrong. He had instead the thing that Marta had pressed into his hand on a January morning 9 years ago, not the brass medallion which had served its purpose and been returned to her years earlier, but the principle it had represented. A thread, held carefully. A connection maintained across distance and time and damage, because the alternative to maintaining it was severing it, and severing it was a kind of answer to the question of who you were that Edric had never been willing to give. He arrived at the gates of Castle Aldenmore on a Thursday evening when the light was going, and the valley below was filling with shadow. The gates opened. Not an army. Not a crown. Not yet. Just a man on a horse, riding home through gates that opened at his approach into a courtyard where Marta was standing in the cold, exactly where she had been standing on a January morning 9 years ago, with her hands quiet at her sides and her face absolutely steady. She looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "He'll see you now." Edric dismounted. He handed the reins to a stable boy who was too young to have been born when he left. He straightened his cloak. He walked across the courtyard he had grown up crossing, past the well and the chapel door and the corner of the training yard, where he had first learned to hold a sword, and he climbed the steps of the great hall and went inside. Cassel was seated by the fire, which was not where the Lord of Aldenmore typically received visitors, and the informality of the location said something about the condition of the man who had chosen it. He was 41 years old and looked older. The illness had taken something from him that was visible in the way he held himself, a diminishment of the carefully maintained physical precision that had always been part of how he occupied space. He looked, for the first time in Edric's memory, like a man who was tired of the effort of being exactly what he had always been. They looked at each other across the fire. 9 years, a wool cloak, 3 silver coins, a legal case, a name, a commission on the southern border, a letter from an old priest, a letter from a dying woman's hands. "Sit down," Cassel said. Edric sat. What they said to each other in that room in front of that fire, over the course of 2 hours on a November evening, is not in any record. There was no clerk present. There was no witness. Marta did not enter the room. The household gave them the distance that households give to conversations they have been instructed not to overhear, and have the wisdom to genuinely not try to. What came out of the room, when Edric emerged 2 hours later, was a document. Not lengthy. 1 page, in Cassel's hand, with Edric's countersignature. It was not a legal surrender. It was not a confession. It was a formal recognition, signed by the current Lord of Aldenmore, of his brother's acknowledged status and of his intention to withdraw all remaining legal objections to the succession proceedings, conditional on a set of terms regarding the transition of the estate's administration that were specific and practical, and designed to protect the household's stability during the transfer. It was, in the language of what it actually was rather than what it was legally called, an agreement between 2 men who had done significant damage to each other and had arrived, through exhaustion and illness, and the unexpected gravity of sitting across a fire from the person you had wronged, at the conclusion that continuing was more costly than resolving. It was not reconciliation. Edric did not know if reconciliation was possible, and was not prepared to pretend otherwise. It was something more honest than reconciliation, and more durable, the acknowledgement, by both parties, of what had happened, and the decision made by both parties with full knowledge of what it cost to stop adding to it. He rode back to Claremont the following morning. Cassel watched him go from the window of the great hall, which was where Edric had been watching his brother from 9 years earlier, and the symmetry of this was not lost on either of them, though neither remarked upon it. Marta walked with Edric to the gate. "He's dying," she said quietly, as they crossed the courtyard. Not a question. "I know." He knew it too. That's why he said yes. She paused. "I don't want you to think it was only that." Edric looked at her. Marta, 58 years old, gray-haired, the most constant presence in his entire life, looked back at him with the unsentimental directness that had always been her primary mode of love. "It wasn't only that," he said. He believed it. He was not entirely certain he was right to, but he believed it. She pressed something into his hand. He looked down. The brass medallion. Small, warm from her palm, exactly as it had been on a January morning 9 years ago. "You don't need it anymore," she said, "but you should have it." He closed his hand around it. He looked at the gate of the castle he had been born in, and that he was about to inherit, and that had cost everything it had cost to return to. "I'll be back in spring," he said. "I know," said Marta. "I'll have your room ready." He rode south into the November morning, and the gates of Aldenmore closed behind him for the last time they would ever close behind him as someone who did not belong inside them. Casilda Aldenmore died in February. He died in the same room where his father had died, which was either fitting or simply the way of households where the master bedroom passes from one generation to the next, and death, being unimaginative in its geography, follows the room rather than the man. Father Rule, who had outlasted everything, was not present. He had died the previous autumn in his monastery near Issoire, at 74, in the quiet and unremarkable way of a man who has said what he needed to say and has no further business requiring his presence. The castle chaplain administered the last rites. Marta was there. A handful of the senior household staff were there. Cassel died without speaking, which was characteristic. He had never been a man who filled silence unnecessarily. The formal transfer of the Aldenmore title and estate to Edric de Aldenmore was recorded by the Count of Auvergne's court in March of 1182, 9 years and 2 months after the January morning, and 4 years after the court ruling that had restored the name. The document is brief and procedural, as such documents are, and contains nothing that would tell you, reading it without context, that the transfer represented anything other than the ordinary succession of one lord by another through the established channels of law and inheritance. The document does not mention the wool cloak. It does not mention the 3 silver coins. It does not mention a January morning or a frost-covered valley or a brass medallion warm from a woman's hand. Legal documents do not typically preserve the human texture of what they record, which is why legal documents are insufficient accounts of history, and why the history that matters most is always somewhere between the lines. Edric rode into the gates of Castle Aldenmore on a Thursday morning in April, when the valley below was green with the first real growth of spring, and the river crossing was running high with snowmelt, and the light was the particular light of a morning that has decided to be unambiguously good. He rode in at the head of a formal escort, 20 men, not an army, but enough to constitute a lord's proper retinue, enough to make the arrival legible to everyone watching as the arrival of someone who belonged there. The Count of Auvergne had provided 6 of them personally, which was a statement rather than a military contribution, and which was understood as such by every lord in the region who heard about it, which was all of them. The gates were open when he arrived. They had been open since dawn. Marta had seen to it. He did not make a speech. He was not by then a man who made speeches. He had been trained by 9 years of situations in which the quality of his thought was more useful than the performance of it, and he had never entirely unlearned the clerk's instinct for letting documents speak, rather than reaching for rhetoric when rhetoric was not required. He rode in, and he dismounted in the courtyard he had grown up crossing, and the household assembled around him with the specific combination of relief and uncertainty and cautious hope that attaches to people who have been under provisional administration and are now encountering the permanent thing. He looked at each of them. He knew most of the older faces, some of the younger ones he was meeting for the first time. He took his time with all of them, which was noted. Then he went inside, and he sat in the Lord's chair for the first time, and he asked Beraud's successor. Beraud himself had retired 2 years prior, to a small house near the village that Edric had arranged through Gobain, to bring him the estate accounts. He governed Aldenmore for 23 years. The chronicles that mention him at all describe him in the compressed factual language of administrative records. He maintained the road revenues equitably, which is noted because equity in road revenues was uncommon enough to be remarkable. He expanded the estate's arable land through a drainage project in the northern valley that his tenants had been requesting for 30 years and that his predecessors had deferred as an unnecessary expense. He arbitrated 3 territorial disputes between neighboring lords at the Count's request, in each case producing settlements that held, which is the only real measure of a settlement's quality, whether it holds, because he had the specific combination of legal knowledge and human patience, and the ability to sit with our no-like situations, until they resolved through genuine understanding, rather than exhausted capitulation. He never married. The chronicles note this as an absence, a gap in the expected biography, without speculating on its cause. The speculation, if one wishes to engage in it, is available in the record of a woman named Sarah, who appears twice in the estate documents, once as the recipient of a modest annuity established in the first year of Edric's lordship, described as a former associate of the household, and once in a note regarding a cottage on the estate's southern boundary that was granted to her use for the remainder of her life. Sarah was his mother, the village woman from the Chronicle's single oblique mention, the woman whose name he had been called by instead of his father's in the years when he had no right to his father's name. He found her in the second year of his lordship, living in a situation that was not quite poverty but was close enough to it to be addressed immediately. He addressed it without ceremony, which was how he addressed most things that mattered to him. Whether they spoke in those years of what had happened and what it had cost is not in any document. Some conversations are private not because they were secret, but because the people who had them understood that their value was entirely in the having of them, and that writing them down would reduce them to something smaller than what they were. Gobain retired from the wool trade in 1185 and lived for 11 more years in a comfortable house in Clermont, visited regularly by a lord who had not forgotten where the thread had started. Father Anselm was appointed to a senior position in the diocesan hierarchy in 1187, a posting he had not sought and did not particularly want, but accepted with the resigned competence of a man who has spent his career being given more responsibility than he asked for, because the people assigning it have correctly assessed that he will handle it well. He and Edric maintained a correspondence until Anselm's death in 1198, by which time the letters had long since ceased to be about law, and had become simply the letters of two old friends who had been through something together, and did not require a specific subject to justify writing. Lord Bertrand got his river crossing revenues adjusted as agreed, and appeared to consider the entire affair a successful investment, which it was. Marta lived until 1190. She died in the castle, in her own room, attended by two of the younger household women she had trained over the years. Edric was present. He had been summoned by a message that used the same carefully neutral language as all her letters, and he had understood it immediately and ridden hard. He held her hand at the end, which is recorded by no document and known because of the nature of what it was, the kind of thing that happens without being written down and persists without being recorded, in the memory of everyone who observed it, and in the fact of what she had been to him, which was the constant thread, the open door on the January morning, the hands that had pressed a brass medallion into a boy's palm and changed the direction of everything. The medallion was in his pocket when she died. He had carried it for 8 years, since she pressed it back into his hands at the gate. He kept it for the rest of his life, which was another 18 years, and it appears in the inventory of his personal effects at his death in 1208. The same year, by coincidence that is either meaningful or simply the way years are, that Elspeth de Maron died in her chateau on the Dordogne with a sealed letter in her private chest. The inventory lists it as a small brass medallion, origin unknown, no apparent monetary value. The clerk who wrote that had no way of knowing what it was worth. What endures from the life of Edric de Aldenmore is not primarily the estate, though the estate endured well-governed and stable, long after he was gone. What endures is the shape of what he did and how he did it, the patience that was not passivity, the anger that was not bitterness, the intelligence that was deployed not in the service of destruction, but in the service of building something that could stand. He had been given every reason to become a man consumed by what had been done to him, and he had chosen with the same deliberate attention that he brought to everything, to become a man defined by what he built instead. This is easier to say than to do. It is easier to describe as an outcome than to imagine as a daily practice. The practice of a young man in a small room above a warehouse, in the January cold, choosing again and again to invest his energy in the future rather than the wound. Not because the wound was not real, it was real. The wool cloak and the 3 coins and the frost-covered valley were real, and the boy who walked into them carried their reality for the rest of his life, in his pocket, in brass. But he carried it as a reminder of where he had come from, not as a definition of where he was going. There is a question that this story does not answer cleanly, because it is a question without a clean answer, and dishonoring it with a clean one would be a form of falsification. The question is whether Cassel was forgiven. Whether the 2 hours by the fire in November, and the document that came out of them, and the acknowledgement that Cassell gave while there was still time to give it, whether any of that constituted forgiveness in the full sense of the word. The honest answer is that it constituted something. Not the same thing as forgiveness, which implies the erasure of a debt, and the debt was not erased. It was acknowledged, which is different. What happened by that fire was more like the setting down of something that had been carried too long, by both men in different ways and at different costs. Neither of them was made whole by it. Both of them were, in the precise and limited way that damaged things can be, relieved of a weight they had been carrying since January. Whether that is enough is a question each person who has ever been wronged, and each person who has ever done wrong, and each person who has found themselves in the complicated middle ground between those two positions, which is most of us, at one time or another, will answer differently, from the inside of their own experience, in the privacy of their own reckoning. The Count of Auvergne, in his commendation letter of 1180, had called Edric de Aldenmore a man of uncommon patience and sound judgment. This was accurate as far as it went. It did not go far enough, which is the nature of official commendations. They describe the surface of the thing because the surface is what is visible, and what lies beneath it is usually only knowable to the person who has lived inside it. What lay beneath it in Edric's case was a boy who had walked out of a gate on a January morning with a wool cloak and 3 silver coins, and the specific, clarifying knowledge that the world had decided he was worth nothing, and who had chosen, not once, but every day for 9 years, to answer that decision with a counter-argument. The counter-argument was his life. He made it well. The gates of Castle Aldenmore stand today as ruins, the walls partially collapsed, the great hall open to the sky, the courtyard grown over with the persistent, indifferent vegetation that claims human constructions when humans are no longer present to contest the claim. The river crossing below the valley is still there, still used, though the road has shifted slightly from where it ran in the 12th century. The chestnut trees along the monastery road at Issoire are still there, or trees descended from them, which amounts to the same thing in the long accounting of what persists. Nothing else is visible from the outside, of what happened inside those walls across those years. Nothing that would tell a traveler passing the ruined gate about a January morning, or a brass medallion, or a letter delivered under a door in the dark, or 2 hours by a fire in November, or a woman standing at a gate with her hands quiet at her sides, holding the longest thread. This is what history does to most of its contents. It keeps the stones and loses the people, and then loses the stones too. And then what is left is only the shape of what happened, legible to those who know how to read it. The shape of this one is the shape of a man who was told he was nothing, and who took the longest possible way back to prove otherwise, and who did it in the end, not by becoming harder than the world that had tried to erase him, but by becoming more himself than it had expected him to be allowed to be. That is the whole of it. That and the brass medallion in a dead man's inventory, valued at nothing, worth everything.